Good day. In this day, I'm going to talk about how to communicate if you've been impacted by a layoff during job interviews. And the first and most common scenario when you'd have to talk about this would be when answering the second most commonly asked interview question of why do you want to work for this company, or why you, or why this role. And what most candidates choose to do here would be to hide the fact that they've been impacted by a layoff, or they will be impacted by a layoff shortly, and choose to talk about something enjoyable, something that makes them look good, something along the lines of, hey, you know what, the company core values, I believe I'll be a great fit in this culture, and this sort of, not too relevant information for your interviewer. My advice to you would be, when answering such interview questions, would be upfront with them. There's no problem if you tell them that you will or you might be impacted by a layoff in a not too distant future, on the condition that you pivot from there and also ensure you sell yourself for the purpose of this job interview. So basically what I'm suggesting you here would be to briefly mention about the layoff and then quickly demonstrate specific relevant expertise using your stories for that specific role. The second topic I'd like to talk about here is on answering the tell me about yourself. So tell me about yourself is the most common interview question. It's basically your passport going into a job interview. Now, of course, ideally, you should prepare job interviews as thoroughly as possible. And however, after doing this for over 5 years on the candidate side, and prior to that for another 5 running an applicant tracking system, I know this is pretty much wishful thinking. So what is some great advice when answering tell me about yourself if you don't have a lot of time to prepare it? Well, first you must understand the mistakes that people do while presenting themselves during a job interview. The most common of them would be employing techniques such as rewarding your answers using AI, or performing a readout of your CVs, or simply memorizing something that will sound too scripted and not really play to your advantage during the job interview. What's the fix here? The easiest way to find out if your tell me about yourself does make sense is to role play it, to rehearse it, to speak it in front of the mirror and see how it sounds. That would be the best way to start. And if you want to know how the best tell me about yourself looks like, it basically highlights 1 or 2 key achievements from the candidate CV that are the most relevant for the role that they're applying for, and then eventually, they would also put that into context to make it sound like, hey, yes, it's still an enumeration, however, I'm still selling myself on my best achievements when pitching myself during job interviews. So if you're early on in the process, what I'm suggesting here, the main challenge would be not to shoot yourself in the foot rather than giving the perfect elevator speech. Okay? The third thing I'd like to talk about here is on the topic of how do you pass interviews these days? Do people pass interviews these days? Yes, actually, people even get dream jobs these days. I'm going to talk about this in a moment. But first and foremost, if you're coming from Amazon, you should understand that if you've prepared and passed the loop with Amazon, you're in a pretty good spot. You know where the bar is in intense job interviews, and you should take advantage of that. Right? Now, more specifically, how do you pass screening rounds? Screening rounds, you should understand that a conversation with the main goal of understanding if you might be a good fit for that given role. If you have no chance for that given role, it makes no sense for you to waste your time with that specific process, right? So long you're intelligible and don't shoot yourself in the foot with AI scripted answers, in my opinion, you're pretty much good to go, right? The advantage, if you can do well in screening rounds, if you interview well during screening rounds, is even if you won't be a great fit for that specific role, they might invite you for other more relevant roles with the same company, roles often that you didn't even know existed. Okay. Now, another note here, another important note is respect to expectations in other FANG companies. So many candidates who come from Amazon expect other interviews with similar FANGs to be not too intense or not too high quality, when in fact, in my experience, there's companies with even more intense and even better quality interviews than that of Amazon's. Notably, Google or Netflix have much tougher interviews than Amazon, so it really makes sense preparing them. Another thing that Amazonians have would be that sharp elbows type of culture. This approach might come across slightly different in other companies. So try, to communicate in such a way that you will avoid sounding arrogant during the job interviews, because it's also a very common trend, unfortunately. And the last note I wanted to make here would be that, yes, today's job interviews are geared towards subject matter experts for these given roles, even especially with companies such as NVIDIA. However, even interviews for subject matter expertise will contain behavioral questions, even if they call them, the googliness or the culture fit test or whatnot. Still, behavioral interviews are 50% of most even subject matter interviews, even these days. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about here, a little bit of career advice of what works in my experience, especially in the context of being impacted by a layoff. So first thing you should keep in mind is that it's perfectly plausible that even if you're impacted by a layoff, you still land a dream job, a much better job than the one you had previously. Okay, this is possible, and I have achieved it with a number of my clients, but you should understand some basic stuff. Even if you are targeting your dream jobs, your first reflex would be to have a backup. Okay, so basically the best candidates I coach, I work with, focused on having a backup job offer from maybe a non-FANG company, something they could rely on, and that would allow them to take more risk interviewing for roles with other FANGs. Right, I've done it a number of times. I've done it successfully with some candidates, but I believe the one mistake you'd want to avoid would be to immediately transition and try to interview with another FANG and risk it all with one single job interview versus looking for backup to play it safe, because rotations are quite normal in corporate culture. So there's always be new roles, there's always be great jobs in these FANG companies and not many other high-performing companies, simply because they're too big not to have these types of rotations. But the challenge is to find these specific roles, and most commonly the way that the candidates find these opportunities would be through referrals and connections. This, I believe, is essential if you want to improve your chances to pass screening rounds. Now, of course, if you have FANG in your CVs, you might also be more inclined to pass them simply because of that. But, referrals and connections greatly help in landing job interviews and going through the first steps of that interview process. During the screening rounds and, during the final interview rounds, it's basically the same as if you would prepare a thorough loop with Amazon. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.